Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us in this webinar. It is one of a series of webinars that Thornton is currently organizing on what we could do or on how we could shape Malta's future. And this webinar specifically is on the property market, on the Maltese property market. To talk about it, I have with me four discussants. So I'll do very quick introductions and then we'll get to the discussion right away. So I'm myself, Daniel Gravino, and I'm a resident academic at the University of Malta, and I'll be moderating this panel. We have with us Ellen Grima, who is the Chief Executive Officer of one of Malta's leading real estate agencies, Daria. He's been there, I believe, since 2008, working with players on both sides of the property market, the buyers and the sellers. So I'm sure we'll get some very interesting insights on what has been happening and what is currently happening in the property market from him. We also have with us Kurt Sherry, who is a resident academic within the Faculty of Laws of the University of Malta. His research interests are very much focused on legal aspects related to the property market, and he was also one of the people involved with the rent reform, which was introduced which came into effect in January 2020. We also have Daniel Zammit, who is the managing director and founder of the DRZ Group, which I believe has been around since 2016 and today boasts a very interesting and to some extent diverse portfolio of property projects. And we also have Charles Warbank, who has a long and distinguished career in trade finance and international banking, and who today occupies the position of Senior Vice President within the front office of the Real Estate Finance Division of Finbank PLC. Right, so thank you very much for making yourselves available this morning, and I'll get to it right away. I think as a way of background, we can all agree that over the past few years, the Maltese property market has made use more frequently than it used to in the past. It's been very hotly debated in public fora, everyone's talking about it. And although there are many reasons for why that has been the case, surely one of the main reasons has been the incredible increase we've seen in property prices. So I'll start with you, Ellen. Can you tell us a little bit about the extent to which prices have risen over the past 5 to 6 years? And in relation to that point, I think it is also interesting if you could tell us a little bit about how the price increases that we're observing now may be different from similar price increases that we've observed in the past, say between 2000 2007. Are there any differences between the two?
Okay, first of all, thank you for the invitation and good morning to everyone. Well, I believe it's common knowledge that property prices have been increasing steadily over the past 6 years. In general, we have seen prices increasing by an average of around 4.4% each year. However, this is only a general measure, which is a good indication, but it usually makes more sense to analyze the changes at a more detailed level, such as, for example, by location or by region. So if we go back about 6 years ago, for example, property prices in the Slima region were increasing at a much faster pace than those in other locations or regions. These shifts are primarily linked to the basic principle or basic concept of supply and demand. So to continue on the same example, when supply in the Slima area, Slima St. Julian, was low, so supply was becoming limited. Prices obviously started to increase, but then demand started to shift to other perhaps more affordable locations. This was actually followed by then shifts in property prices in other locations like central areas or southern locations. So at the time, we had started noticing price increases in places like Marsaskala and Zurri and nearby localities. Around November of last year, price increases started to slow down. So for the past 7 to 9 months, we started experiencing more stable prices. However, when the COVID pandemic hit, most people were actually expecting property prices to go down. But this did not actually materialize, with obviously the exception of properties which were priced above their market value. So in fact, during COVID, we did carry out a public survey to determine if rather than determine to understand if property owners were considering a price reduction due to the situation created by the pandemic. However, the responses received through this public survey suggest that almost all owners who took part in our research were in fact not considering any price reductions, but were rather willing to hold on to their properties to wait a bit more to see how the situation would evolve. As you said, Daniel, the property market was also very active between 2000 and 2007. So this was, as we all know, this was the period leading to Malta joining the European Union. And at the time, the property market was also very active, and which had resulted at the time in an increase in property prices. In fact, in certain locations, again, because we usually talk about property market in general, but certain shifts or changes are usually focused on certain regions or locations. And at the time, between 2000 and 2007, the increases in certain locations, particularly between 2003 and 2006, were quite substantial. If we had to compare that period with now, we still find that apartments and penthouses and maisonettes are still the most common types of properties. But significant changes between that period and now are that at the time we had also terrace houses, which were very popular, whereas now the requests have shifted to more townhouses and houses of character. And one reason for that could be as well because obviously the number of terraced houses that are available is nowadays very limited when compared to then. Another major difference which is more evident now than it was back then is the increase in the number of transactions related to investments with regard to the short-let market. So in the period between 2000 and 2007, obviously we had no Airbnb, we had or the short-let market was very, whereas now there are quite a number of properties which were bought specifically for such a purpose.
Thank you, Alan. I think that sets the background for the rest of the discussion very nicely. You made it very clear and understandably so that although we do speak of the property market as a whole, the devil is in the details. And what I've clearly gathered from your discussion is that it's not as simple as saying that property prices have increased at a relatively fast pace in general. There are certain areas, certain localities in Malta which have been experiencing those price increases long ago, whereas you have others which have caught up only recently. But I think it would be fair to say that in general, in all localities nowadays, if we compare, say, to 8-10 years ago, property prices have increased at an incredibly fast pace. You mentioned a figure of over 4.5% or something in that region, which obviously amounts to a lot. Now, obviously, what that's an incredibly striking statistic, particularly when you compare it to how much the income of people has increased during the same period. And that brings me to you, Kurt. Can you provide us with some insight about the extent to which this incredible increase in property prices might have created affordability issues primarily for the Maltese or anyone really, anyone residing in Malta? And in addition to that, if it has created any affordability issues, what are your thoughts on what government should be doing about it?
Obviously, I mean, when we talk about affordability, there's no doubt that these have been very challenging years for Malta, especially if we concentrate on the segments which until a few years ago, particularly young couples and young individuals, and also, if you like, we also include post-divorcees and separating couples, which until a few years ago, even if when they wanted to access the property market, there seemed to be relatively few issues of affordability, both in terms of financing as well as in terms of property prices. So banks were willing to finance their property purchases, and property prices were more or less reasonably related to what was the income, the medium income at the time, the average income. Then what happened? We started noticing a difference in 2015, because even if you go through the statistics published by NSO with particular respect to the labor force survey, you could notice that wages were going up, the average age was going up, but if you go to the elementary occupations, the rise in the wages of people employed in elementary occupations was much more timid than it was in the higher earning occupations. And it was basically within those segments that one could notice that problems of affordability started arising. Now, this was obviously related to what was happening in Malta, because we had quite a few demographic changes, and there were two main patterns which were identified in the white paper published by the Parliamentary Secretariat for Social Accommodation, which is now a ministry, which was published in 2018. And these were mostly that, first of all, there were internal patterns, so those related to an increasing number of family breakdowns, which was obviously increasing the demand for property. And it was also changing the kind of demand, because obviously when you have a separating couple, you have two individuals who are now looking for smaller properties. And secondly, the other trend was obviously the one which was quite spectacular, which was that of the increase of foreign employees. When you take these two phenomena at once, and I also add a third one, which was the increase in tourism, and something which some commentators overlook at times is the tremendous impact. And it was related both to supply as well as demand. So first of all, it was related to demand, because obviously the tourism industry needed a larger workforce, which meant that Malta was attracting a number of foreign workers who were precisely in the tourism industry. But it is also related to supply, because several landlords were deciding to go for the short-term Airbnb market rather than the long-term residential market. And also, this obviously had the consequence that the supply for the longer-term accommodation was contracting in favor of Airbnbs or short lets. And what was quite impressive was that in statistics published by the MTA this year, it results that up to 1/3 of the nights spent by tourists here in Malta were spent precisely in private accommodation. So this is perhaps now what we're expecting in terms of rental affordability. We've already seen that rentals have become more affordable, because obviously some investors might be considering shifting their strategy from the short term to the longer term market, meaning that there is a greater supply of properties for long-term residential accommodation. And also, we need to see in general what the effect will be on property prices in general, because if buy-to-lets and buy-to-let loans were being taken out in order to invest in the short-term property market, it is probable that this demand now for property will obviously be significantly reduced following the outbreak of the pandemic.
Thank you, Kurt. I think sort of taking the gist out of what we are saying, what you are saying, is that if we look at the pre-COVID period, there were some clear trends, some clear challenges as far as affordability is concerned, and in particular for those at the lower end of the income distributions, because truth be told, some incomes have risen at a markedly fast pace, but others haven't increased as much. So that certainly creates some affordability issues. And that may be particularly relevant, I'd imagine, for the younger workers who are sort of in the early years of their career, and they're probably the first-time buyers. So that sort of, sets me thinking, with some affordability issues existing in the pre-COVID period and the challenges that it has brought about. We've seen the income number, a large number of people lose their jobs, access to but let me put this question to Daniel. Daniel, you work, obviously you're in the business of developing residential units. No one is probably as well placed as you are to gauge the demand for this sort of property. Can you tell us a little bit about, how much the COVID period has affected the demand for residential units? And in addition to that, is it a question of just demand, or were there other challenges that have slowed down activity in the property market?
So during the COVID period, saying in the months of March and April, demand not just slowed down, but was practically inexistent. One of the main reasons was because of the social distancing and lockdowns and working from home. So estate agents and potential buyers were not visiting property to purchase, and thus the sales, new promise of sales agreements literally dried up. However, adding to that, where promise of sales were already signed and were coming up for contract, the main banks in Malta, because most property purchasers obtain a bank loan to finance their purchase, also due to restricted measures in social distancing, their capacity to do contracts on a daily basis went down a lot. So appointments for new contracts were being given much further away than we were used to before. This last one, eventually it worked out better for everyone involved, because as we know, the government then issued the legal notice where tax on property purchases was reduced a lot. So it saved a lot of money both for developers and new purchasers. During the period of the COVID as well, as I was saying, that new promise of sales, they little dried up, but now, especially after the new tax measures, we're seeing a lot of interest again. And the main effect of these measures was that they saved a lot of promise of sale agreements that were already signed, and they were coming up for contracts. And also due to the new, where the buyers are now paying tax of 1.5% instead of 5%, it has created appetite for new sales. So recently, the last month or so, we're seeing again an increase in demand, maybe on the same lines as before the COVID period came along.
Thank you, Daniel. I think that's some very interesting insight you've provided us there. So basically what you're saying is that during the COVID period, activity slowed down for obvious reasons. Everyone is to some extent locked down inside. Bank appointments are obviously delayed or were occurring at a much in smaller frequencies. At the same time, what seems to have kept the property market during the early days, the early weeks of the COVID period, were the promises of sales which would have been signed, which would have been agreed to earlier. But if I understood you correctly, the demand right now hasn't really shrunk that much. It's still, the demand is still there and it is still going strong. In part, probably incentivized by the schemes that government launched only recently, as far as the tax on property is concerned, and also the support that he's offered on some bank deposits. And that brings me to you, Charles. It looks like, from what Daniel has been telling us, that the demand is there really, and we know that there are a lot of Maltese investors who are very keen to continue investing in the property market. And for that to happen, there's got to be the financing for it. So I wonder what's current appetite for financing really.
Daniel, to open, I listened to what Daniel said, and I agree with him entirely. The comments he made reflect exactly what we've seen. In other words, the bank issues waivers, and the promises of sales that were concluded. We see that happening now, so it would seem as though business is going on unabated. So I agree entirely with what the observations Daniel made. In the post-COVID lockdown, obviously banks are in caution mode because we've never seen this thing happen, and we're apprehensive of what the outcome is. But in terms of our appetite, I would say our appetite for residential developments that are within, say, the 180 to 250,000 mark, is still there, because that appeals to a broad spectrum of buyers, and they're going to be there in any way. I mean, they would appeal to your first home buyers, investors, a point that Alan made about single occupancy, people divorcing and all that. It would appeal to people what I would call single occupancy, and also for foreign buyers. So yes, we're still very bullish about those kind of developments. The next set of residential properties would be the 250 to 380. That would appeal to your dual income earners or people who want to upgrade their properties. I think there's still a mark for those. So in that respect, even in this post-COVID lockdown, post stage, we're still very optimistic there. To a lesser extent would be your higher end, developments. There, obviously, I think we will wait to see what the outcome within the next few months will bring. So that is basically our view, but we are still receiving requests for new projects, new developments, to the extent that it was pre-lockdown.
Thank you, Charles, for that intervention, and I think in many ways that is also good news. to the developers who are willing to put their money into the property market. So up to this point, we've basically said that, you know, over the past few years, we've seen an incredible increase in prices. It's obviously it brought with it some affordability issues, in particular for those in the lower end, at the lower end of the income distribution. But demand, in particular by first-time buyers, still seems to be strong, and banks' appetites to finance those sorts of real estate projects seems to still be there and strong. So, well, I haven't mentioned much up to this point, or we've touched upon it only briefly, I believe, Kurt, a little earlier in his earlier intervention, is what has been happening in the rental market. And there we might have a narrative which is very much related to what we've been discussing, but perhaps slightly different developments and trends. And that brings me back to you, Alan. Could you again tell us a little bit what has been happening in terms of pricing as far as renting is concerned, and in particular, if you could make a distinction between the pre-COVID period and the during COVID period?
As we know, the rental market was extremely active over the past 6 years. Again, this was mainly coming from an increase in demand, which was primarily triggered by foreigners who were relocating to Malta for employment or residency purposes. This increase, I believe, was in itself triggered by various market forces, such as, for example, the requirements coming from the financial and gaming industries, as well as the various programs introduced by government, mainly those related to investment and residency. The changes in rental prices over the same period were therefore also reflecting once again the demand and supply element, with such changes varying according to locality or to the respective region. So, for example, the average increase in rental rates over the past 6 years in the St. Julian's area was in the region of 26%, whereas in St. Paul's Bay, in the St. Paul's Bay area, like St. Paul's Bay, Bujibba and Aura, it was between 30 and 35%. On the other hand, in southern locations like, for example, Marsa Scala and Birzabuja, the average increase was between 20 and 25%, which is substantial. It's not a low figure. Naturally, again, as rental prices increased over the years, demand started to shift according to what Kurt mentioned, according to affordability. As well as supply, because obviously supply was going down and affordability was becoming an issue. However, earlier this year we did start, this is before COVID, so we did start to notice that rental rates had actually started to stabilize. And this was following the introduction of the rent regulations. With regards to the effect of the COVID period and the economic slowdown on the rental market, as I said, the property industry, our industry, practically took an immediate hit as soon as the pandemic hit the islands. So it was cases were being announced today, and our industry took a hit the following morning. So it was really bad. And even with the introduction of certain measures and restrictions by government, obviously we couldn't work as we usually do. And one of the sectors within our industry which also experienced an immediate drop in demand was the short-let market. So this had resulted in a substantial increase in the level of supply within the rental market, because in a matter of days or a couple of weeks, practically something in the region of 7,000 to 8,000 properties which were listed on Airbnb. Most of these landlords or most of these owners were considering or were seriously considering to go into the long-let market rather than long-rent rental market rather than leave their properties empty. Moreover, given the travel restrictions introduced in various countries, including Malta, new demand for rental properties, even now, and I'm referring to the long-let rentals, was practically non-existent. So it was more of the same clients or more of the same tenants going around and looking for better opportunities. In our case, however, most landlords were extremely cooperative and fully understood the difficulties experienced by their tenants. In fact, most tenants were offered additional temporary conditions aimed at helping them to go through this difficult period, and in most cases, this resulted in a further reduction in rental rates. So, for example, on average, rental rates in the Sliema St. Julian's area were reduced by approximately 20% over a period of 2 to 3 months, and in some cases even more. Whereas in the Aura and Bujibba area, by an average of 14%, Marsa Scala area by an average of 16%, which again, it is substantial. Again, these are general figures, average figures, so one would need to analyze the figures in more detail to get a better idea of what is happening in specific locations. But this was confirmed in a recent article published a couple of weeks ago in the Times of Malta, which in fact analyzes the effect of COVID-19 on the rental market in much more detail. But in a nutshell, the economic slowdown has actually negatively affected the rental market, and obviously landlords had to react accordingly.
Thank you, Alan. I think that you've provided us with a very clear picture of what has been happening, and my understanding is that we have two very different realities in the pre-COVID period and during the COVID period. Surely, I mean, the situation that you've described, inexistent demand for short-term letting and so on is, surely temporary, depending on how long this COVID pandemic will continue to impact us. But probably many people are eager to see what will happen next. But allow me for the time being to just focus on the pre-COVID period. You mentioned that rental prices were increasing at a relatively fast pace. Perhaps the acceleration occurred during different periods of time at different localities, but the takeaway point, I guess, is that rental prices were increasing, so much so that at one point government felt that there was the need to regulate the rental market. And that brings me to you, Kurt. Can you start by telling us a little bit what were the original aims of the rental reform? And it would be, of course, be very interesting for us to learn or to have your views on the impact that it has had on the rental market, both the good things and the bad ones.
Yes. So the main objectives, you may say, were twofold. First of all, there was the need for more clarity in the market, in that there was a situation where you had the two contracting parties who were coming together to sign an agreement, but let's say in several cases, landlords would not provide a written agreement. For example, they would only concede a verbal agreement. In other cases, it would be an agreement, but it would be imperfect, so therefore not valid at law. And also there was no regulator. That is, in the case of a dispute, one had to go to court, and obviously then you have to go by the lengthy judicial times and the fees and so on. So it was a market which was not offering so many guarantees for both investors as well as users, and so for both lessors and lessees. The second aim of the reform, other than giving a greater degree of certainty and stability to the market, was that of enabling government more or less to oversee what was going on, because there was no data relating to the rental market being collected from any government entity. So, and not even from what we were learning, did the private sector have such a, let's say, was not even in possession of such detailed statistics which are required in order to devise housing policy. And obviously, there was also related to this the problem of under-declaration. We had a problem where rental income was hardly being declared, despite government reducing the final withholding tax on rentals to 15%. So by any European standard, if you look at other regulations in European countries, it is by far the lightest form of regulation, the less invasive and the less intrusive. In fact, what the reform did most of all was to formalize practices which were already in existence. That is, the minimum term was only fixed at 1 year, and 1 year was the term for which most leases were being agreed. And secondly, it did not affect rental prices. So the only case where the rental price would be controlled if landlords enter a long-term agreement, during which, of course, they would need to be tied to clear conditions. Otherwise, the tenant would not be afforded any stability. If the landlord would be able to increase the rent every year by, for example, a very high rate, and therefore resulting effectively in an eviction, because the tenant would not be able to afford the rental. So it was a very light touch regulation, and in fact, the market has responded positively. In fact, until the end of June, we had the housing authority had up till 13,000 registrations, which was far more than the most optimistic forecast that the state had at the beginning of the year. Now, with respect to the impact, let's say the criticism, if one looks at the criticism which is received, I think it is mostly coming from people who were used to not declaring their rental income. Because when one looks at the legislative framework, it is hardly interfering. There are provisions meant to curb abuse and to limit abusive practices by landlords. But other than that, I mean, there is full contractual freedom with respect to duration and to price. So what we saw rather was that landlords were going to the housing authority to register willingly, because they saw also the benefits of having a formalized relationship with their tenant, even should anything go wrong, and they would need to go to court. They would have a much stronger basis. With respect to what can be improved, something which is being worked on at the moment is the obligation on the lessor to notify the lessee 3 months prior to the termination of the agreement in order not to enter into an automatic renewal phase. Therefore, a new requirement is for the landlord to notify the tenant 3 months prior to the agreed expiration, so that the contract would not be renewed. And the law specifies that it must be done by registered post or by registered mail. And the authority at the moment, I know, is trying to change this in order to make it easier for the landlord to notify the tenant. Other than that, obviously, COVID did let's say upset any sort of research which was any sort of research study which was being conducted at the time, because it's very difficult to compare, even because obviously the authority only has data relating to the first 2 months of the year, and I suspect it's not sufficient to make a complete comparison with, or rather to get a snapshot of what was going on prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we did see, however, is that prices did go down, obviously due to the reduced demand, and also because of most of this was a side effect of what was going on in the labor market, with people being paid lesser wages or not or being laid off. Therefore, one has to see how the market will recover. One final point, what one must observe during these times is certainly the recovery of the tourism industry, because this is crucial. The Central Bank of Malta estimates that there were around 8,000 Airbnb listings. Now, with less tourism, with less inbound tourism to Malta, one can expect these 8,000 properties, well, some of them, a segment will remain vacant. But the rest will either be sold, meaning that they will increase the supply in the property market, or else they will be rented out for a long-term residential purpose, meaning shifting demand from the short-term to the long-term residential sector. So the tourism industry, or rather the lack of activity in the tourism industry, might actually improve affordability in both the sales as well as the rental sectors.
Thank you very much, Kurt. So what you're saying sort of suggests that it's still early days since the day that the rent reform actually came into force in January 2020. But well, your thinking is that in many ways it hasn't been too invasive, but it has brought more transparency and organization to a previously very much unregulated property market, which I guess is fair. And also, at least in your view, it shouldn't have had any direct impact on rental prices. So in many ways, you feel that it's reaching its original objectives, not interfering too much in the market, but at the same time bringing the necessary transparency and organization that would put everyone's minds sort of at rest, both the tenants and the landlords. I think there are many benefits. Surely there are many benefits to that. Obviously, you make the very good point that at the moment it's not business as usual, so it's very difficult to sort of gauge what the actual impact on prices has been. But in this, I think you've also mentioned it in your earlier intervention. A lot depends on the other factors that are influencing the property market, and primary amongst those is the demand from tourists for short-term lets. And that is probably very true. At the same time, we also expect that, or you would hope that impact is only temporary until sort of the tourism sector recovers to its pre-COVID levels. But how long that takes, one still has to see. So in this interim period, surely we're all very curious to see what's happening there. Allow me now to shift my attention to what's currently happening and what we think will be happening in the future. And that takes me to you, Daniel. If you look at the number of residential units that had approved permits by the planning authority over the past 2 to 3 years, the figures are incredibly high. So we're talking anything in the region of 27,000 permits for new units. That's obviously a lot. And, with all the uncertainty that COVID has brought with it, and in particular with respect to demand for residential rents, do you expect those property permits or those new units to come onto the market at this speed at which they will? So that would be the thing. And the other thing that I'm interested in is your view on whether what's happening in the residential rental market, sort of the temporary, or for now we can think of it as a temporary drop in demand, whether that will have any impact on the prices that people are paying for purchasing properties for their own use, for their residents.
So, Daniel, in the residential market, although we say residential property, there are distinct purchasers for the residential property, and the main ones are the ones that we normally speak a lot about are the local and the first-time buyers that whatever is going around, if these sort of purchasers will always need to purchase their first residence. Maybe they will delay a bit, but they will still need to purchase where they live. Then there are the local investors that they want to purchase a property to rent it out. And the rental market is then again subdivided, as we're saying, into the long term and the short term Airbnbs. So to put it in the picture then, recently, the past years, there was an increase in the permits issued, but as we all know, during the past years, there was a lot of activity in the property market. That activity attracts the attention of various investors and various other developers, and due to that increase, there was an increase in the permits. Will all these permits be translated into new property in the market immediately, in short term, longer term? I say it will depend on how that investor developer has financed that property. We have to keep in mind that when a permit is issued, there are a number of years that can be extended by a further number of years until one can start using that permit. So another factor that we have to keep in mind is that once a site has started construction, there's a period of a couple of years, depending on the size of the project, until that property is ready and can be handed over to the purchaser. Okay, the purchaser might have purchased it before on plan, but there's a period of time for that property to be handed over. Going back to the original question, will these permits be translated into new property coming onto the property market? As I'm saying, it will depend on the investor how has financed that property, because some investors might say if they have purchased it from funds generated by their business and there is no external financing like bank loans or bonds, they might decide, listen, we can wait on it 1 year, 2 years, and then we'll let the market stabilize and we start the project there. Others might decide, listen, it's a down market, but we can still use internal funds, we can still continue meeting our financing payments, and thus during this down period, we will use it to finish the property. So when this, let's call it negative cycle, we'll get out of it, my property will be ready, and when the positive cycle comes back again, my property will be ready and I will cancel it immediately then. So it's not a clear-cut answer, yes or no, if it will take time to come to the market or not, because it depends a lot on the investor developer and how they are set up and what their business model is about. Again, regarding the effect of the rental market on the first-time buyer market, I agree with what Kurt was saying before. There might be a number of properties that were intended for the short-term market. We're hearing numbers of around 7,000, 8,000 properties. And yes, there will be an amount of these properties that their owners will decide, listen, the tourism market for the coming year to 2 years is going to be less than what we're used to recently. So they will decide to sell that property to use the funding for other investments or whatever they want. And it's always a question of supply and demand. If the demand increases by a couple of thousands properties, I don't believe that prices will go down, but definitely they will not keep increasing. There won't be an increase in the short term, and that will benefit the first-time buyer market as well.
Thank you, Daniel. So basically, I mean, perhaps it was an unfair question of me to ask, because obviously no one can sort of predict the future. But I think your insight has been very useful in helping people like me understand what to expect going forward. So when I mean, with all those approved property permits, there might be some uncertainty as to how many of them will actually come onto the market in the near future. And from what I've understood, a lot of that may depend on the financial strength of the individual developer or the individual investor, and the method of financing, so on and so forth. So that very nicely brings me to you, Charles. I mean, you're obviously representing Finbank here, and you are responsible for obviously making sure that the money that you lend to developers can actually be repaid. So surely your views on the future of the property market will help us sort of gauge a little bit better what might happen and what we might expect. What are your thoughts? And if I may add a tiny question, so that I don't intervene while you're talking, would you also be able to tell us a little bit about how the currently low interest rate environment might impact any of the activity that's going on?
Let's go through, how property is traditionally financed. Normally it's debt. Debt means people come to the bank and you borrow money to finance. That would be your traditional, and more often not, it's on like a pari passu basis, sometimes 70-30, different ratios, but that would be your traditional form, and it has been for many years. What we did, by the way, the good thing about debt is you pay as you use. What we see as a change, obviously, is from debt we're going into capital borrowing. People, instead of going to the banks, coming out with bonds, particularly, the bond market has the prospects. Prospects is now you can go up to 8 million on prospects. The interest rates are very reasonable. The charges structured is reasonable, and there is a mechanism in place that makes it fairly accessible. So we're moving there from debt to capital. My observation about the capital market is that unlike debt, you don't pay for what you use, you pay for what you're given. So basically, once your bond issue for 5 million, 8 million, you're going to pay for those 8 million from start to finish. So, my observation would be, if you're going to go down that road, make sure that you are going to have utility for those funds for the whole period. Otherwise, you're going to keep paying for them, and then there are the cost of your sinking fund. That comes with a cost as well. But anyway, so we've got debt, we've got capital markets, and then we have a thing that I think again one of the private investors. Well, we see private investors coming in a number of ways. In equity, or what once upon a time was called barter. So I own a piece of property, I come into an agreement with the developer, he develops it, that is a form of private investment. There could be private investment in the financial, where I have a stash of money that I want to invest. I come into an agreement with the developer. You could set up an SPV or just come to a contractual agreement, and that happens. The other form, which I think we're seeing more often, is a structural private investment. And I'll tell you what I mean. you get your promise of sale, which is slightly more elaborate than the normal. In other words, you'd have, say, a certain percentage on the signing of promise of sale, and then certain percentages paid as the development progresses. We see that quite a bit. That is a form of private investment at the end of the day. The developer is being funded, as the progress of the development by the investor. The only other two that we don't see so much of, but I suspect that they will come into the equation later on, would be things like syndication, club deals, and risk participation. Till now, you don't see a lot of banks joining together. Like recently, there was a fairly large bond issue. Now, probably one bank would not have taken that on its own, but if they got into a syndication or a club deal between banks, or even some form of risk participation, that could have been done again under a debt structure and not under a capital structure. And I think I personally, as a banker, I would like to see more of those taking place. That way, the capital market will take away less of our market. The other product that I would think we'll be seeing more of is equity release. You now have a lot of seasoned developers, a lot of them with a good portfolio of property, and you'd find that banks will be giving them equity release, what one might call a business opportunity type, facility. That is where we see, in terms of bank borrowing. Now, coming back to interest rates, interest rates, there are obviously a number of factors that affect interest rate. I don't want to sound preaching, but basically you got your base rate with euro, so the base rate is Euribor. Euribor since 2015 has been in negative. Banks have zeroed it. Now the prospect is that till the end of 2021, it's probably going to remain negative. So that factor is not going to change at all interest rates. The only thing is after 2021, there's going to be a regulation issue coming along with interest rates, which might actually tip the scales from taking Euribor or euro rates into the positive. Unfortunately, there is no precedent to this regulation, so getting a projection of what will happen is very hard. But usually interest rate hikes would be in the nature of about 25 basis points, 0.25% every 6 months maximum. So even if you have to take that on a longer term basis, I don't see that there would be a really large impact, given as well the high level of liquidity that banks have presently. So that is what the other factors, that affect the interest rates. Obviously, is risk, which makes sense. So the good thing about what we're doing is lending against movable assets, the term, the tenor. So if you're usually with residential, we're looking at 36 months. And the market forum. Now, what we've seen definitely in real estate lending in Malta is that it's become very competitive. A lot of banks, a lot of players are coming into the market. There's a lot of competition for this space, and that keeps the banks honest, and interest rate down. The only other thing that affects, obviously, adversely real estate is the cost of funds. Now, the cost of funds in terms of actual cost of funds, that's fairly cheap presently, because as we said, because of the euro rates. The only thing that amplifies the cost of funds for real estate lending is what is known as the capital adequacy requirements. The capital adequacy requirements, real estate funding is considered speculative. Consequently, it's 150% risk weighted. That escalates the cost of funds. But this is where we are, at least from our perspective, in terms of interest rates and funding. Well, that is our perspective. I don't know if anybody has any views or on any of those points.
Thank you very much, Charles. If I may, because we're very quickly running out of time, I'll pick on a few points that we've just mentioned, including the ones that you just did. So essentially, what we've said is that rental rates have changed quite a bit when you compare the pre-COVID period to the period we're currently in. So there have been drastic changes in the levels of activity as far as the rental market is concerned. There's a lot to look out for, many interesting factors. In particular, we are still to see the full impact of the rental reform, which in its early stages seems to be very promising, even in terms of the number of contracts that have been registered with the authority. But obviously, more is to come. Similarly, we hear there is some uncertainty, or one has to wait and see as to what happens with the incredibly large number of property permits that exist or that have been issued in the latter years, whether they would actually come onto the market at the same speed as they did before, or whether people, investors might decide to sort of take a more conservative approach and sort of delay the actual construction of the buildings. And what's also very interesting to learn today is that the banks themselves, having been resting on their laurels, but they are fully aware that there is competition from other sources of finance, including the capital markets. But from what Charles has been sharing with us, there's already some thinking as to how banks can actually make themselves or in these projects by, for example, looking into something that has been relatively untapped, such as syndicated loans and so on. If I may, because we've really run out of time, there's a question by one of the followers of this webinar. Possibly, Ellen, you might be in a better position to shed some light on this question. And he or she is asking whether we are foreseeing any decrease in investment in property by foreign nationals, given the context of what's happening around the world in terms of dividends paid out into investments and pension funds.
Foreign nationals usually consider various factors before deciding to relocate to Malta or to any country, or before investing in property in another country. Over the years, property in Malta has also shown to be a very solid investment. So although we are at the moment experiencing a slowdown in the level of interest from foreign nationals, I believe that this is temporary. We have to obviously keep in mind that there are still a lot of restrictions in other countries, so people may still not be 100% convinced that they should or that they can travel. But as I said, I believe that this is temporary, because the property market has always shown, and the Maltese property market has always shown to be a good investment. And then there are the other factors which we have which can form part of our Malta package. So our climate and the usual stuff.
Okay. So perhaps a temporary blip, but we shouldn't expect or we shouldn't be too concerned about potential future investment from foreign nationals. So I think we can bring the webinar to a close right here, because we've exceeded the allocated time. Thank you very much for your time, and good day.